our hot takes for the 2024 NHL draft, some discussions about the offseason trades of some prospects that were moved around, and we're going to be looking back at our 2021 NHL draft rankings, all coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, Sebastian and I break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. It is the 1st of September. We're going to be breaking down some interesting subjects for you today. We're going to be starting off with some hot takes for the 2024 NHL Draft, some early kind of predictions on our end as to what happens on draft day in July. We're also going to be looking at some of the prospects that were moved around in the offseason, where they've ended up, what to expect from them, and all that stuff. We're going to be including guys like Nathan Légaré, Gianni Fairbrother, even Alex Newhook, and a lot more to talk about in today's episode in our second segment. And finally, we'll be ending things off with a look back at our 2021 NHL draft rankings, a look at our hits, our misses, what we've learned from that, what we've improved, and just the difference in our scouting philosophy since then. But before we get into any of that, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them down below. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always very much appreciated. So, Sebastian, let's get this started with our hot takes of the 2024 NHL draft. Now, there's a very contentious defenseman in the 2024 NHL draft class. Some people think he is the second coming of Rasmus Dahlin. Others think he's got a lot of wars to work on. It's Artyom Levshunov. I haven't talked to two scouts so far who've had the same take on him. So talk me through what you see out of him, and what exactly is your contention regarding Levshunov?
Levshunov is a really interesting prospect. He has some very, very strong tools in a vacuum, but I haven't really seen much of a toolkit in terms of all-around usage of what he has. He's decently mobile, but especially offensively, had a lot of question marks still with how he approaches the game. He can be very, very trigger happy from the blue line, and when he does activate, he doesn't consistently pierce defensive structures. When he does, it's often when there are really massive openings that won't be there at the NCAA level, where he is playing this season. And I'm not going to make any massive claims until I get to watch a decent amount of him playing against college competition, because D-1 USHL tape will only get you so far. But I've seen a player who is intriguing and has some first round intrigue for sure, but nothing that I've seen has really screamed to me a top 15 talent. And I've seen him in some mocks being a top 5 guy. So that hasn't quite been in line with what I've seen so far, but it could easily still be a sampling issue. But everything I've seen has been all right and okay, but nothing to me that screams like high impact NHLer just yet. So I still have some bigger question marks there, but that seems to be a hot take at this point in time, because I've seen quite a few rankings that have him as a staple inside that top 5. And while he has produced quite nicely in the USHL, I haven't quite seen the play to back up that production.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is kind of the best warning you can give as a scout in terms of putting out rankings this early, because this is exactly why we're waiting to put out our rankings till September, October, because we want to watch some regular season games before we get into it in the draft year that they're going to be kind of scouted for. That's really essential at this point in time, especially for these young players who most of them only have kind of international tournaments to talk about, or very, very early season kind of D-1 tape to talk about. That's not really representative of what we can expect from them, but regular season tape more often than not gives you a good idea of what to expect from them moving forward. That brings me to Ivan Demidov, who is, in my opinion, a contender for number 1. And this is a hot take. I know it for sure. I've had many people tell me that I'm jumping the gun on this guy, that it's way too early, and et cetera, et cetera. listen, I know talent when I see it, and Ivan Demidov has it leaking out of his ears. He is one of the most skillful, if not the most skillful player I've seen in this draft overall. I can't really name you many guys or really anyone who I could see exceeds his skill level, his ability to understand opposing formations quickly and adapt to them and make the right move at the right time. He's just ridiculous to watch, and I haven't had this much fun watching a prospect in a long time.
For sure. I think we both agree that Demidov is among the most enjoyable players to watch. And
yeah,
the first like official viewing that I logged for the 2024 draft class in this offseason, where I was really delving in shift by shift of how a player was playing, was a viewing of Demidov, and it was an absurd viewing. We have a tool grading system at Dauber that rates tools on a scale of 1 to 10. And last season, the only 10 that I gave was for Connor Bedard's shot.
Yeah.
And in my first viewing, I already gave Demidov's handling a 10. It is not he's not a conventional handler at all. Like he really is not like it's a bit difficult to describe. He plays with tremendous fluidity, and his hands just work perfectly with his style of play. And it's very much a thing where his handling is geared towards how he approaches the game. And it is incredibly effective against pretty good competition. And the game I watched was against the MHL. So there's always more space and time to work with for sure. But this is a player who, in my view, is clearly a high-end skater. He is tremendously dynamic. He's an elite handler. His ability in offensive transition to not only be a primary rusher, but to really exploit defenses and shift his body weight around to hit small openings is second to none in this draft class from what I've seen so far.
Absurd.
And he's incredibly adaptable in the offensive zone. I think a lot of his value comes from just how quickly he's able to process his situation and react to it. He goes into a situation and he rarely is skating at his top speed, and he's extremely adaptable at medium speeds, far more so than D-1 players should be. And as a result, he's incredibly creative offensively. And when you add into that an impressive defensive engagement that doesn't necessarily scream Selke, but definitely is not the norm for a skilled, diminutive offensive piece that is available at the top end of the draft. A really refined and versatile player here who, sure, the physicality is quite clearly the thing that he needs to work on. He definitely needs to bulk up a little bit, but genuinely everything else has really impressed me. And all I can say at this point in time is that there's no player in this draft class I've enjoyed watching more than Ivan Demidov. And as of right now, if you were to give me a choice to build a franchise around either Celebrini or Demidov, I'd be slightly siding towards Demidov. And that could be a bit reactionary. It could whatever. But at this point, I don't really care because everything I've seen of Demidov has been absurd. And he's a ton of fun.
No, absolutely. Fully agreed. The skill set wise, just through the roof. It's just some of the best hands I've ever seen. And you combine that with the offensive skill, with the goal scoring ability, with the playmaking ability. It's next level. It's really interesting to see. I headed into this draft class thinking there might not be a kind of top end kind of, borderline elite first line player. But as much as I like Macklin Celebrini, that was kind of my impression heading into this draft in terms of the top end. No one of even Adam Fantilli's level, let alone Connor Bedard's, but Demidov shifting my perspective on that. One last little thing I want to talk about is Aron Kiviharju. I've seen him all over the place. I've seen people have him outside of the top 10. I've had people, the highest I've seen him really is maybe 6th or 7th overall in these early rankings. I don't understand it. Everything I've watched of him just screams top 5 pick to me. I'm still convinced that he could be in contention for the best defenseman in this draft class. With Adam Jiricek was also in this conversation, but for me, it's definitely Kiviharju in terms of the professionalism of his game, his ability to stay composed under pressure, his ability to wriggle his way out of trouble. A lot of people look at defensemen who were ranked first overall very early in their careers, heading into their draft year. And kind of get that Timothy Liljegren kind of shell shock situation going on. I think he's closer to Rasmus Dahlin than Timothy Liljegren in terms of profile, in terms of abilities, and in terms of ceiling. So we'll see where that goes. But for me so far, Aron Kiviharju looks like a lock in the top 5. But again, it's very, very early in the draft year. We'll get into that a lot more in detail as the year goes on. But that wraps things up for our first segment. And we're going to get into our second segment where we talk about some of the offseason trades for prospects, some of the prospects that were moved around during this offseason since July. We'll get into it right after these messages on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets, guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 get $100 off the NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props to over and unders and far more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL.
All right, so moving forward to our second segment, we're going to be talking about some of the offseason trades that involve some prospects around the NHL. So I want to get started with the big name. I'm not sure he's still even. He wouldn't be considered
he's
a prospect.
Not really a prospect.
Yeah, but he's young enough.
We're stretching the limits of the title of this podcast here.
Yeah.
But he's very fun and he's still young, and he's a player that I believe we both scouted in his draft year, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Alex Newhook is a guy I watched in detail, and I really liked this game. I had him in the top 15 when I ranked him in 2019 rather. And since then, he hasn't lived up to the expectation that I thought he would reach. But he's still been very decent, and I'm really interested in seeing what happens with him moving forward with Montreal. They've done really great work with Kirby Dach, traded some assets for a young player who's assumed to be RFA, who's looking into kind of changing airs and reaching a new environment that'll help him thrive more than the environment he was in. That fits Alex Newhook's playbook to a T. So I'm really interested in seeing what happens with Newhook and how that compares to Kirby Dach's situation, because Newhook has a really interesting skill set. He's one of the fastest and most dynamic skaters that you'll find at this level. The stick handling abilities through the roof. He plays at a very high pace. Everything he does very quickly. The main issue with Newhook has always been the fact that he doesn't really slow down plays. He's always accelerating plays. He's an accelerator as a player, and that has its limitations because, yes, he's good at high speeds, and yes, most of the time against lower end competition, he's able to outpace them and just bring the game to a level, to a pace that only he functions at properly. And that helps him kind of separate himself from a bottom six, from, it helps him work against a bottom pair defense on the other side or stuff like that. But as soon as he reaches a top 6, as soon as he reaches a top 4 defense core, you're looking at players who are used to playing at that level, who are used to playing at that speed, and can match the Alex Newhook's footwork, who can match him mentally, and things break down. So I'm curious to see how that works out for Montreal and how they develop him. But, what would you predict for Newhook heading into this season for Montreal?
Newhook's a player that I've liked a lot, especially like in his draft year. This is a guy who lit up the BCHL and was really showing off a lot of skill and a lot of pace, which is a very fun combination, especially when you're playing against low-end competition. And when he translated quite seamlessly to college hockey at Boston College, I was getting a lot more hopeful. And while, yes, his play definitely stagnated in the NHL once he hit it, this is a guy who, look, I watched a couple games of his like last season and watched enough that in April I put out a tweet basically saying like that if I'm an NHL team trying to buy low on a young potential top 6C with the possibility of also signing long term, that Newhook was really a guy that I'd be looking at quite hard because he still plays with a ton of speed and skill, and he tries things. He consistently tries things, and he wasn't pulling them off too consistently in Colorado. But in my view, if you are able to kind of work a little bit more on his risk assessment and on kind of picking and choosing the moments that he makes those attempts and goes full speed ahead, that he could become a really dynamic and impactful player. I think another part of the issue, as you mentioned, of the fact that he's always going at a high pace, it's not just that he's not able to slow the game down, it's also that his high pace becomes predictable, right?
Yep.
And I think one thing that he needs to learn is to make it's to become more deceptive offensively and to kind of pick and choose the moments that he explodes with that speed, because otherwise he kind of loses that advantage, which is a massive advantage in the NHL.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think the Montreal system is going to benefit him a ton. Not only is he going to get opportunities playing as a young player, but Montreal also a team that has a lot of players that slow the game down, right? Guys like Kirby Dach and Nick Suzuki like to play that, like really slow down the pace and be very, very cerebral with how they approach the game.
Yeah.
And Newhook adds a different element that I think is really going to help the forward core as a whole. And it also will allow him to kind of ease into learning how to slow the game down, because he'll have players that are quite literally his age that do it very, very well, that he'll be able to learn from. And hopefully they'll also be able to learn from him and learn when to kind of really up that pace a bit more, because I think both Nick Suzuki and Kirby Dach are players that could use a higher pace at a higher consistency sometimes. I think both are guys that slow the game down a bit too much.
Absolutely. While we're on the subject of Montreal, we can talk about Nathan Légaré, who they just added in the acquisition of Jeff Petrie and that 3-team trade with Pittsburgh and San Jose that allowed Pittsburgh to pick up Erik Karlsson. Not sure how that works out for them, but that's another subject. Nathan Légaré isn't really much to talk about, really. I'd be surprised if we get anything in terms of an NHLer out of Légaré. Montreal has a great farm system with a lot of depth. I'd be surprised if one of those depth options ends up being Légaré, but I think he's going to be a decent AHL option. And players going out of Montreal, we have Gianni Fairbrother, who was traded out of the system. Fairbrother's a decent acquisition, I think, for the Colorado Avalanche system. Really decent in terms of what he brings to the game. High intensity, high defensive value, very physical, very punishing defenseman. I don't think you're really getting anything offensive wise out of him. He's got a really hard shot. That's about it, right? It's the hard shot. It's not even accurate. So I'd be surprised if he's any sort of offensive contributor at the NHL level, but I do see a pathway to him becoming a number 6, number 7 defenseman who fills in at times and plays a couple of games. That's about the best I could say out of Fairbrother.
I fully agree. I think he missed the entirety of last season to injury, and that makes things a bit harder to predict here. But going into last season, Fairbrother was a player that, in my mind, was kind of in the same grouping as guys like Caden Gooley and Arbor Jacki of prospects that could crack the NHL. The projection is quite different long term, but I thought he was quite close to being NHL caliber, at least in Montreal system. So we'll see just how he progressed with his injury last year, and whether he was able to make any steps in perhaps like the mental sides of the game or in terms of strength and explosiveness. But this is a player that I can totally understand why Colorado took a shot on him, because he has some decent defensive tools and could be a really decent low event bottom pairing defenseman in 1 or 2 years time. And I don't think he needs too much time to kind of reach his peak. The main question is where that peak really lies.
Absolutely. Moving forward, we've got Filip Zadina. I want to know, he went from in 2018 saying that he would fill Montreal's net with goals and basically talking up his game to being waived for the purpose of contract termination and being picked up by San Jose. What happened, and is anything salvageable? Is mainly what I'm wondering in this situation. I think the answers really rely on the fact that there hasn't been much improvement in this game since being drafted, which is a big issue, because he's essentially the same player he was in 2018. And is that a reflection of Detroit's farm system and ability to develop? I don't think so. They've been really good at developing players when they're overseas, when they're outside of their farm system. And Zadina, I believe, jumped right into the AHL, which did not help in this situation. It was a big jump to pro, and often when you jump too early, you can see issues like this with stagnation. But maybe that's where it relied. It was mainly just making a player make a jump way too early based on what they needed. But I don't know, man. It just, there was something about Zadina in this draft year that seemed very, very promising. And it's just, What do you make of all this?
I don't fully know. I liked him quite a bit in his draft year in 2019. I think I don't think I made my rankings public that year. I was only really getting started of getting interested in scouting and the draft. But I think on my personal document, I had him in like the 5-6 range, like relatively high for sure, like around where he ended up going. And I think what really stood out with him was the skill in the QMJHL. And I think he was one of the cautionary tales of the QMJHL dropping off a little bit compared to the other big leagues in the CHL in terms of quality. I think if he'd been playing in the OHL or WHL, it may have been a different story. Because I've gone back and watched some draft year footage, and he was dominating against QMJHL competition. But it's a step below the other CHL leagues, and I think that played a role. But I think more than that, there's so many different factors that it could be. He's a very confounding case for me too. Like I don't quite understand how he hasn't developed as much, but I am very curious to see how he does this year, because he's likely going to get some minutes playing with a guy like Thomas Hertl, which will be very, very good for him. I think that like those two players are quite complementary in stylistically at least, and we'll see if Zadina can actually stick around playing top 6 minutes, even on a team that has low expectations like San Jose. But this is a guy who could break out as a decent middle of the lineup guy, but there's also a very realistic chance that he kind of burns out from the NHL, and that would be rather unfortunate as a player who was just so obscenely skilled the draft year. But it also is kind of just telling of how no matter where players are drafted, and no matter how skilled they are as 18-year-olds, we are projecting 18-year-old kids as playing, like, and we're trying to think of their play styles as 25, 28-year-olds, right? And that's a difficult thing to do. And there's always going to be some players that just don't develop like you expect them to. And that's kind of the name of the game with scouting hockey players.
Absolutely, it is. That wraps things up for our second segment. Now we're going to be coming up on today's episode. We're going to be looking back at our 2021 NHL draft rankings, looking at our hits, our misses, where we went wrong, where we went right, all coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects. All right, so to end things off with our final segment, we're going to be looking back at our 2021 NHL draft rankings. We've got both of those pulled up on each of our side here, and we'll be looking at the players that we were right about, the players we were wrong about, what we've learned since then, what we've learned from that, and how that's kind of shaped our scouting philosophy moving forward. I'm going to start off with a player that we kind of both had way lower than he should have been, and he's really locked himself up as the best prospect out of the 2021 NHL draft, and it's Owen Power. He was drafted first overall, probably should have been first overall on most boards. I slipped it down to 6 because I had some big concerns with the projectability of his game, with his ability to read the game at a high level, not taking into consideration the fact that he was playing on a Michigan team where he was relegated into a defensive role, and placed out of his shell. And once he joined Buffalo and showed what he could do in his rookie year and the year after, it was very clear that that was the case in Michigan, that he wasn't playing the role that he should have been. And that affected our rankings, didn't it? I mean, I had him 6th overall, and I believe you had him 7th.
7th. Yeah. I think the big thing I've learned from this whole situation is that I think I was overly harsh on his defensive game, because it wasn't a strength of his in his draft year, and that's okay. Just because he's a 6'4" defenseman and plays with physicality doesn't mean that he had to be a defensive stalwart at that age. And the offensive creativity and the offensive toolkit and the overall just raw upside in his profile was tremendous as a draft year. But I think, at least for me personally, it was an overcorrection, because I saw him being ranked first on every single board, and I just didn't see that level of him playing compared to other guys in his draft year, like Matty Beniers, for instance. I thought was leaps and bounds ahead of Owen Power as a draft eligible. But look, in retrospect, it was just a thing of Owen Power was a raw prospect, and Matty Beniers was very refined, and we saw it this year with the Calder race as well. Like, I think Owen Power projects as a more impactful NHL player in 3 or 4 years' time, but he didn't deserve to win the Calder, because Matty Beniers is just a very, very excellent player at this age already. But he was a clear miss, I think, for both of us. I think 6th and 7th is definitely lower than he should have been, and I think, like, he should have been first or second on my board for sure with hindsight. And Buffalo made a good pick at 1 yet again.
Absolutely. I do want to talk about Fyodor Sveshkov as well, who was picked up, I thought, way later than he should have gone. Sveshkov, I had 8th overall in my rankings. Where did you have him again?
I had him a bit lower. I had Svechkov ranked 14th.
Yeah, he ended up going 19th overall to the Nashville Predators. He's 6 foot, about 180 pounds, plays with what I thought was the best brain in this draft, in the 2021 NHL draft. The intelligence, the awareness, the advanced processing, the layering of thought processes, the ability to see the game 3-4 steps in advance really, really impressed me. And I had him ranked very high as a result of that. But the main issue with Sveshkov since then is that his game's actually regressed. He had a great year last year in the VHL, which is Russia's second division of pro hockey, 30 points in 31 games at the VHL level. But then this year it's dropped off massively, and he's under half a point a game in the VHL, which isn't looking too good. He did play, I believe, 20 KHL games or 27 games.
Had, I believe, 4 points.
4 points, yeah. So not really the type of progression you would expect out of a player like this. And the main thing I learned out of this was you need more than brains. You need a high end. You need a high motor first and foremost. On top of that brain, and on top of that, you need the skating speed in order for your brain and your feet to be on the same page. Usually, it's very rare that a player with really bad skating but really good smarts makes it, because most of the time you're processing the game faster than you can actually play it, which is a bit of an issue. And that's mainly what I've seen from Svechkov since this draft year. And since then, it's made me kind of mold my scouting philosophy around, guys like this who have that level of intelligence and defensive game. You'll usually see them in my kind of mid to late first round now, rather than at the top end in the top 10. That was also the cautionary tale I had regarding Francesco Pinelli, who was essentially the same issue. Really, really, really smart. One of the smartest players. I had him ranked 10th overall. He ended up going way lower than that, I believe, in the mid-second round to the Los Angeles Kings. And since then, he's stagnated in the OHL and hasn't really developed his game in the ways that I thought he could. He's the best player on the Kitchener Rangers, for sure. But you need more than smarts, and he's developed a goal-scoring game that's really good. He's developed with his playmaking game even further, but I'm still waiting to see more than that. In terms of misses, do you have anyone you want to mention for your rankings?
I mean, I have 2 players that I think a lot of scouts missed on. Matthew Nyes and Wyatt Johnston are both players that I'm sure we both had ranked far too low. I believe I had Matthew Nyes ranked 80th because I believe he had some health issues in his draft year, and his style of play completely shifted as a D+1. And Toronto saw that coming, and very, very few public scouts did. So Toronto definitely did their homework on that pick, and it is aging superbly well. And Wyatt Johnston is another one that Dallas just completely hit on. And this was the season that was lost to COVID, and we really only had the U18 tournament to judge a lot of players on. And Wyatt Johnston was playing a third-line checking role and was doing it very well, but that was kind of limiting his projection because kind of just that coaching decision of deciding to have him on the third line was what kind of influenced his stock in my eyes. And I think a lot of other scouts were in the same boat with that because there is so little game tape going around in this draft class. But let's also focus on a couple hits. Let's not entirely just be self-deprecating and negative about this. I think we definitely had some nice takes in here. And I think one of mine that I'm still very proud of is having Logan Stankoven ranked where I think he should have gone, which is 12th overall. I had him ranked high and was a massive fan of his motor. He was my favorite player for Canada at that U18s tournament in terms of just how much I enjoyed watching him play. Incredibly impactful, dual threat offensively, and he's just continued growing from that standpoint since then, and is now looking like quite a nice prospect for the Dallas Stars.
Absolutely. And that brings me also to Olen Zellweger, which was one player we both had our eyes on. I was a bit lower on him because he landed very late on my rankings, and I was wary about the kind of late riser kind of tag that he had attached to him. But you had him ranked 19th, so kudos to you. And that's honestly Probably should have been higher than that in retrospect.
Oh yeah, it's still too low.
Prospect. Yeah,
it's still too low, but it's within the right range at least. Like it's getting close. But yeah, I think with hindsight, he'd be a top 10 pick.
Yeah.
Olen Zellweger is a really special talent.
Absolutely.
And a couple other ones I'll throw out there. I had Jackson Blake ranked 38th, which I'm really happy with. I'd probably keep him in the same range now. He's progressed really nicely since his draft year. Really skilled player, typical Carolina pick of undersized, skilled, and really damn smart. So he's one of my personal favorites. But what are your last couple ones that you want to stake your flag in?
I have to throw Jesper Wallstedt in the mix. I had him ranked 4th. You had him ranked 3rd. I'm astounded he dropped to 20. For me, he's top 2, top 3 in terms of goaltending prospects in the NHL. You have him first, which I respect. I can understand
it's tight, but yeah.
I love Devin Levi way too much to have him below Jesper Wallstedt, but Wallstedt is very close in terms of that conversation.
For sure.
One of the most athletically skillful and technically refined goaltenders that you'll find. So those are the guys that we kind of hit or missed on in the 2021 NHL draft. And it's been a really, really fun experiment looking back at these, especially before recording. We're looking back at these and being like, man, we missed on a lot of these. We had some really good takes as well on some of them, but yeah, that wraps things up for today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe, leave us a comment. If you have any questions, put them down below. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They got all your news and updates about the sporting world. Just keep you updated on what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next episode. We're starting off the month of September pretty strongly, and we'll have a lot of content coming up for you. So make sure to tune in for that. This has been Hadi Kalakesh and Sebastian Hadi, and we hope you tune in next time.